The People of the Secret. Chapter 1. A comet crosses the sky, and it furrows the earth and men's wits with the energy of its passing. Asteroids collide and scatter their substance across the heavens. On Earth, a continent sinks, an island re-emerges from the ocean. A desert becomes a new sea. A fertile land becomes a desert. Nations, whole races rise, decline and disappear, leaving only legend to mark their place and their passing. All accident, all arbitrary thrust and collision of blind forces signifying nothing, or all purposeful, intentional, having reason and significance within some present moment vastly greater than we can imagine. Until very recent times, there was little doubt in men's minds about the answer. Things happened by intent. The intent might be benign at the level of human life, or it might be hostile, but at some level, on some scale, it was meaningful. Even if the intent was implacable, the existence of intent was never doubted. The serpent has swallowed the sun, and the Lord giveth, the Lord taketh away are observations separated by millennia, but they represent the same unquestioning acceptance that somebody or something exerted will, and that by extension, purpose, high arbiter, governed all. So it was for untold generations of men. Then across the space of a few brief centuries, a new picture was forced upon us, and the basic assumption that had supported man, consciously or instinctively, for perhaps 20,000 years, went into the discard. It so happened that Western science had chosen to investigate natural phenomena from a certain, it now appears arbitrary, standpoint, and had discovered that it was possible to isolate the forces that produced phenomena. It discovered also that it was possible to invoke these forces, to duplicate phenomena, and to predict the outcome. Suddenly there was no place for purpose in the universe. Phenomena in a purposeless vacuum worked perfectly, and the principle of Occam's razor, not to introduce, arbitrarily elements not necessary to explain what has to be explained, baby was thrown out, a little gleefully, with the bathwater. The universe, it now seemed, was a mechanical system of P1 and pushes. There was no free will because all was determined advance. There was no contingency. Where mechanical law were total, there was no place for either. Given the coordinates of one event and sufficient informant, one or all future events would be predictable. The universe would either run down or blow up. We did not yet have enough data, say which, but one or the other. If enough monkeys danced long enough on enough typewriters, the complete works of Shakespeare would in the end type themselves. It was statistically inevitable. All observed phenomena, including life, were now had to be accidental consequences of purposeless forces acting at random without the agency of anything whatever outside the ultimate mechanicalness which was the ground of nature. Life presented no problems either. Higher forms would evolve from lower forms because mechanisms inherent in earlier situations contained the inevitability of later situations. Whether our superstitious ancestors liked it or not, this was how the universe was. Intellect had solved the ultimate secret by showing that there was in fact no ultimate secret. Demonstrably, there was no ghost in the machine. With some reason, this release from previous assumptions was accompanied by euphoria. William of Ockham, of the 14th century, collaborating with the 20th century, had abolished God, and the scientists, brash in their newfound freedom, saw themselves as the founding fathers of a new future for humanity, a new world order, sane, rational, enlightened, unsuperstitious. All the untenable assumptions of the past were error, and they had been swept away by what Wells, as late as the 1930s, could call the brotherhood of efficiency, the Freemasonry of science. With the hindsight of even 3 or 4 decades, this view now seems startlingly ingenuous, but nevertheless the generations which produced it deserve praise for their honesty. They were being true to their lights, and they had no reason to suspect that quite different lights would presently become uncomfortably visible. Having concluded that mechanism was all there was, Western science began to notice that at the extreme micro and macro ends of things, disquieting events could be obscured, which suggested that somehow mechanism, which undoubtedly existed, also existed side by side with something alarmingly like free will. Some experiments had shown that energy was a continuous stream. Others, equally convincing, suggested it was corpuscular and discontinuous. One experiment suggested that a quantum of energy was concentrated enough to hit an individual atom. Another showed that it was so large that it could divide itself between two slots cut in a gross metal plate. Worse, energy seemed to know in advance whether there was one slot or two and to modify its performance accordingly. At the other end of the scale of size, Einstein's work, for the layman's understanding at least, seemed to boil down to the discovery that 2 and 2 no longer made 4, except perhaps in those negligible areas of ordinary sensory experience where the difference was unnoticeable. In 1925, some of the world's top mathematicians had a look at the problems that had piled up in consequence of the work of Bohr, Planck, de Broglie, and Einstein. They came to a very strange conclusion. All the anomalies inherent in the new data could be accommodated and handled quite well if you used only equations. You could not under any circumstances form a picture of what was going on. Mass, length, and time, the basic coordinates of a mechanical universe, were simply ineligible as units for dealing with the situation that had now emerged, which was intolerable. Things must be either here or there, not maybe here or maybe there. 2 and 2 must make 4. In a universe whose basic laws, as uncovered by Western science, expressly excluded uncertainty, how could there be uncertainty? In 1927, Heisenberg suggested the principle of indeterminacy, and from that moment on, the push and pull universe was on a diminishing economy. After a partial absence of only a few centuries and a more or less total absence of only a few years, the ghost was back in the machine. It was ironic, perhaps, that the ghostly suspicion was first conjured into visible appearance in the sanctum of physics, the most materialistic of the sciences, and equally ironic that psychology, the most idealist of the sciences, should succeed for much longer in ignoring the ghost in its own machine, ESP and the like, and strive so doggedly to rehabilitate Lord Kelvin. Here again, Western science to a certain extent was the victim of its own attempts to be honest. The behaviorists were being true to their lights. Human behavior was demonstrably mechanical, and a push on a chemical rod in the human engine produced a psychic effect, as causally and as certainly as the push of an iron rod produced a physical effect in a steam engine. While physics had been driven screaming into a non-sensory continuum, psychology did not quite see how, even if it wanted to, it could follow suit. Although Jung had perhaps sketched the hazy outline of such a country, its terrain continued to be regarded as in some way preternaturally unscientific. Like a Pavlov dog, Western science felt itself subjected to intolerably conflicting impulses which it could not resolve in action, and predictably perhaps it became neurotic. Could it be that the West's dilemma at all levels was caused by the same recurring mistake, that of artificially limiting the field of inquiry? This seems to be illustrated in at least one unlikely aspect. In all Western scientific inquiry, it had been tacitly assumed that data for the solution of its problems could arise only in the West. This is essentially an unscientific assumption, but one that was made imperiously at all times. As it now begins to appear, data for resolving the West's scientific impasse was available in the East all along, but the East's culture and philosophy, both ancient and modern, was consistently assumed to be either puerile or defective, or both. The knowledge of the East was not tried and found wanting. It was assumed to be inferior and not tried. Nor was the evidence of significant data in the East in any way hidden or difficult to come by. Some extremely significant pointers to certain branches of inquiry, which had already been confirmed in the West, were lying about inviting attention. Jalaluddin Rumi, 13th century, was on record with a theory of the evolution of form, 600 years before Darwin. Suggestive pointers to very sophisticated psychological processes, like the mechanism of learning, were outlined in the traditions of the Coptic Church and the Suhrawardi Sufis. It is difficult to avoid noticing that this astigmatism in Western science confirms one of the axioms of the West's most heterodox philosopher, Charles Fort. 3. What might with affection be called Fort's theorem declares that if you encounter data which lie outside an area which you have defined for yourself as containing the only possible data, you will either fail to see it altogether or else will plausibly discredit it in terms of your own prior assumptions. In fact, in 1927, when Heisenberg was giving form to the cat that had appeared among the pigeons, the solution to the West's scientific impasse was already circulating unobtrusively in Europe and America, an apparently fortuitous accident of Eastern origin. Perhaps aid to underdeveloped countries works at different levels. This material did not take the form of a scientific paper and was unfamiliar in texture. It did not therefore have the impact which the West would normally accord to a revolutionary idea. It took the form of a very ancient teaching about the nature of man, and few thinkers in the West noticed it at all. Fewer still saw that behind its unfamiliar appearance lay a method of reconciling the apparently insoluble conflicts of Western science. Although this material was probably of universal application, it had one aspect of extreme pertinence for the dilemma of Western science in the first third of the 20th century. It implied that free will and causality were not irreconcilable. Both could be accommodated within a framework that possessed different qualities of time. Causality, in fact, could be the field of operation for will at another level. The West had been quite right in detecting both, quite wrong in its assumption that they could not exist together. Remarkably enough, this idea already existed in the West, but had taken root in certain unwarranted assumptions of occultism, and, having no apparent justification, had been passed over. By contrast, many of the corollaries of this teaching have had almost instinctive currency in huge populations in the East for several millennia. There it takes the form of a legend that the affairs of humankind, the ebb and flow of history, are subject to purposive direction from a higher level of understanding, the process being manipulated by a hierarchy of intelligences, the lowest level of which makes physical contact with humanity. This idea, at a simple level of exposition, was presented recently in a book review in a popular newspaper, the writer having apparently summarized material which is now more or less openly available in the West. The writer said, "For many centuries there has been a strange legend in the East. It suggests that in some hidden center, perhaps in the highlands of Central Asia, there exists a colony of men possessing exceptional powers. This center acts, in some respects at least, as the secret government of the world." Some aspects of this legend came to the West during the Crusades. The idea was renewed in Rosicrucian guise in 1614. It was restated with variations last century by Madame Blavatsky and the French diplomat Jacques-Oliot, was suggested again by the English author Talbot Mundy, and most recently by the Mongolian traveller Ossendowski in 1918. In the mysterious Shangri-La of this legend, certain men, evolved beyond the ordinary human situation, act as the regents of powers beyond the planet. Through lower echelons, who mingle unsuspected in ordinary walks of life, both East and West, they act at critical stages of history, contriving results necessary to keep the whole evolution of the Earth in step with events in the solar system. If in the West this seems like a very tall tale indeed, it is one nevertheless that has engaged thinkers behind the European scene for centuries. In 1614, for example, when a mysterious document called the Farmer appeared in Europe, some of the best intellects of the day spent a generation chasing clues to its origin and trying to get themselves enlisted. There is no historical record of anybody succeeding. A hoax? Maybe. But in 1961, an article appeared in a small magazine which to the ordinary reader seemed like a simple travel documentary. To others who knew, or believed they knew, how such things are arranged, It produced much the same effect as did the farmer on their forebears 350 years ago, though attempts to enlist were not this time quite so disastrously negative. Since 1961, a further stream of hints seemingly connected with the same tradition have been appearing regularly. The writer then lists a number of recent publications, deals with them briefly, and goes on to conclude, "The tradition of which all this seems to be a part has been linked with such diverse phenomena as the restoration of culture after Genghis Khan, Arabian poetry, the troubadours, the joker in our playing cards, Freemasonry, the Templars, the Renaissance, the Saracen culture of Spain, and the Franciscan order of the Roman Church." It has also been noted that some of the latest ideas in Freudian and Jungian psychology were outlined by members of this same tradition as long ago as the 11th century, when there was no Western vocabulary capable of dealing with the ideas. In view of the extent of the claims which are implicit in some of the literature now appearing in the West, it is remarkable that orthodox scholarship has not yet, apparently, responded with the interest which this material would seem to justify. If we include the above quotation, our total material so far converges on three distinct, if startling, suggestions. 1. That in the first quarter of the 20th century, Western science had not only reached a critical stage, but an impasse, and that, simultaneously, material possibly capable of resolving the situation appeared unobtrusively from the East. 2. That this intervention derives from a source superior to, and qualitatively different from, ordinary intellect. 3. That similar intervention occurs at critical points in human history, and has done so in all cultures and all ages in a form appropriate to the moment. Preposterous as these ideas appear in the context of Western thought, we shall examine them in turn. There are reasons for believing that between 1920 and 1949, an influence of the kind suggested in above operated in France, England, and America. To avoid compromise with the sometimes fragmented language of occultism, we shall refer to the source of this influence simply as the tradition. Part of the intention behind the 1920 to 1950 operation appears to have been to reveal publicly, perhaps for the first time, the mechanism of the tradition's own operation. It might be conjectured that human intellect had for the first time reached the capacity for processing the evolutionary ideas involved, and had perhaps earned entitlement to this information. Among those who were in contact with the tradition during this period and whose subsequent life work reflected its aims were a London journalist, Rodney Collin, and the mathematician and philosopher J.G. Bennett. Rodney Collin wrote two significant books in which he attempted to show that both biology and history functioned in a different kind of time from that experienced in events normally registered by the senses. These books were significant in many respects, but perhaps chiefly so in that they suggested that the matters now being handled by Western science could not be dealt with by ordinary linear thinking. This was the conclusion that had already been forced upon the mathematicians of the 1920s, but they did not possess the key to the radical solution which Rodney Collin now suggested might exist. Rodney Collin also attempted an analysis of Western history in which the decisive operations of schools of the tradition were suggested. In this survey, a great deal of Western history took on a startling and vivid new dimension. Events and sequences in history, which to even the most perceptive of historians had appeared random and meaningless, were shown to be purposive in terms of will acting in a different kind of time. The mechanicalness of events and the automaticity of people were in fact the building material out of which intelligences immediately above the level of man contrived an intentional structuring of events. Behind the partial freedom from causality in which these intelligences worked, there lay a larger aim, that of nurturing and tutoring the life of the Earth so that it might remain harmoniously in step with the evolution of the solar system. Collin attempted to give a progressive, logical development to his exposition, suggesting, for example, the consequences that might be deduced from the absence of a zero term in a geometrical progression. But in the main, the impact of his work was an emotional one, and it probably lacked the essential overlap into the orthodox field necessary to attract the attention of ordinary science. This appeal to science, in terms which it might plausibly regard as its own, had to wait another 12 years for the work of J.G. Bennett. Bennett had made contact with the tradition soon after the 1918 armistice and remained in contact with it until the operation was withdrawn, about January 1949. Bennett believed that the operation of the tradition at this stage held decisive possibilities for mankind. Science was truly at a crossroads, and if it took the wrong turning, or continued on the course it was following, it would inevitably evolve into a prolific but sterile technology. He probably saw this in its fullest implications long before the same warning began to circulate from artists, poets, and intuitive philosophers like Orwell. Bennett's tremendous work, The Dramatic Universe, was 40 years in preparation, the last volume finally appearing in 1966. A man's life starts with a fertilized cell, and his earliest life is worked in cellular time, perhaps 1,000 times faster than clock time. Multiplication of cells and the functions which unfold from them are conducted at terrifying speed, so that a whole phase of evolution is recapitulated in the fetus in a matter of days. Compression is at its maximum at the start. Progressively less and less happens as an organism achieves extension in time. Less and less inner process, that is, happens in each successive interval of clock time. Man, however, chooses to experience in clock and calendar time, and it seems to him that time goes increasingly fast. His life accelerates from beginning to end. A period of 24 hours seems an age when we are toddlers. A whole week, a month goes by like a flash when we have grown old. From this and other indications, it is deduced that to represent biological processes as they are, and not as we happen to experience them, against clocks and calendars, we should have to set out a human life on a logarithmic and not an arithmetical scale. The period of man's gestation is 10 lunar months. The period of his childhood is 100 lunar months. The full span of his life averages 1,000 lunar months. If these points, 10, 100, 1,000, are marked at equal intervals around a circle, we may have some representation of a complete life, together with milestone marks that show the rate at which inner events have occurred or will occur. Various cosmologies can be constructed on this scheme which do not concern us here. The figure is, however, a starting point for obtaining an organic picture of history. We shall return to this in a moment. If the basic proposition is accepted that history obeys the same laws as cellular life, an interesting series of analogies becomes available. As cells perform different functions in the body of a man, so men perform different functions in the body of a culture. Masons, engineers, and architects maintain and replace the structure of a culture just as their corresponding cells maintain and repair a human body. There are soldiers and policemen to defend a culture, as there are reserves in the adrenals to defend the human organism. There are scientists and thinkers to direct a culture, as there are brain cells to direct a body. There are poets and artists and mystics who form the emotional life of a culture, as there are nerve cells to conduct the emotional life of a man. Analogies can be extended in many ways. For example, a human life may be based on the satisfaction of eating and drinking, or on the excitement of movement and travel. It may be ruled by a passion for research, or by some deep emotional drive. Similarly, a culture may be ruled by one functional group. Peasant states, merchant states, warrior states, and monastic states come to mind. A man who is balanced in his functions, but who is led by a developed intellect, is an advanced man. So a culture which is balanced in its functions, but is led by a developed intelligentsia, is an advanced culture. The analogy between the body of a man and the body of a culture was glimpsed by the pathologist Virchow more than a century ago. It has since been noticed by many scientists, but is generally held to be too fanciful for serious study. There may be reasons to suppose that it is not fanciful enough. a sperm cell originates a new individual. Suppose a conscious man originates a new culture. Suppose that within life there are always a few men, unsuspected and hidden, who are able to process conscious energy and are therefore in touch with the pattern of conscious energy outside life. In J.G. Bennett's terminology, this would correspond to the demiurgic level. Such conscious men would be to a human culture as a sperm cell is to tissue cells in a human body. A conscious man would inseminate a new culture as a sperm cell fertilizes a new individual. Not all sperm cells originate new men, and not all conscious men would originate new cultures. Those that didn't would nevertheless vivify a culture, tilde abundant sexual energy tones, and vivifies a man. Here may be glimpsed one aspect of a sexual, even an incestuous, analogy which permeates both myth and epic poetry, and is, at surface level, always incomprehensible. If a civilized culture has such a structure, it should be possible to represent any of its aspects from its cellular equivalent. Its timescale, for example, would be some extension of the logarithmic scale which appears to apply to human life. Rodney Collin suggests that the logarithmic terms of human life, 10, 100, 1000, should be extrapolated into the series 100, 1000, 10,000 lunar months, which is roughly 8, 80, and 800 years. If the analogy holds, 8 years will be the period of gestation of a culture, 80 the period of its physical self-expression, and 800 years the total of its life. At the end of 800 years it will die. Some men die before they are 70 or 80. Some live to be over 100, but the intervals given by the 10, 100, 1000 lunar month series will represent the human average, and the periods 8, 80, and 800 years will represent the average for cultures. During the 8 years that a culture is in the womb, the conscious man who has impregnated it gathers round him a body of material, an inner circle of disciples. A teaching is worked out. The teaching is the personality of the coming culture. It may take the form of artistic expression or a new principle of science. Perhaps a book is composed or a code of principles. Some symbol is worked out which will be the signature of the culture till it dies. A culture's character, like a man's character, is formed in the womb, and the whole of its life will be an expression of that character and no other. 80 years is the period of a culture's physical expression in the outside world, exemplified in the dazzling expansion of invention and creation, which is so visible and so inexplicable at the beginning of each cultural period. Perhaps the dispersal, which J.G. Bennett related to the appearance of the 4 root languages, is the first glimpse we can hope for of this mechanism at work. This example may, however, be exceptional, since it involved not 1, but 4 simultaneous operations. On the other hand, it may be less exceptional than it looks if we notice that the 6th century BC, which was the century of Pythagoras and the century when Europe was born, was also the century of Buddha in India and Confucius in China. It is not without interest that the cyclic nature of culture, the birth, self-expression, decay, and death sequence, has been partly deduced by ordinary intellectual means by men like Toynbee and John Napier, though there may be reasons to suppose that the inventor of logarithms was in touch with a contemporary operation of the tradition. The analogy between cells and cultures may be extended further. A son does not wait for his father to die before he can be born himself. Similarly, the generations of culture overlap. A new culture begins long before its parent dies, and perhaps while its relatives on another continent are still adolescent. We may also suppose family strains in the body of civilization which is made up of all cultures, taken together. However different the men of Rome may seem to us, we have some sense of kinship with them. We and they are of the same family. We do not have the same feeling of consanguinity with cultures of, say, Africa or China, even when these are more recent than Greece or Rome. The cell/culture analogy may even yield a method of rediscovering the past where this has left traces too faint to suggest an outline. Suppose cultures take their place in the long body of humanity in the same sequence as the glandular functions emerge in a man. Also, that these functions lie on the logarithmic scale. The succession should lie, therefore, on the sequence: pancreas, thyroid, parathyroid, adrenal, posterior pituitary, and anterior pituitary. Is any trace of such a sequence discernible? Such essence nature as it may be possible to glimpse in past cultures, Rodney Collin suggests, do not appear to contradict this scheme. The traces of Aurignacian man are heavy, lymphatic, and lunar. Magdalenian man is swift, decisive, and thyroid mercurial. The vast stonework of Egypt, Sumer, and ancient India suggest the poised, solid parathyroid or Venusian nature. The Greco-Roman and Persian periods are ages of iron, passionate, adrenal, and Martian. Early European, medieval, and Renaissance cultures, till the near present, correspond to posterior pituitary function. Plotted on the logarithmic timescale, it would seem that the 6 functions so far developed in the long body of humanity occupy places lasting 32,000, 16,000, 8,000, 4,000, 2,000, and 1,000 years respectively. Earlier, it was suggested that a culture is begotten by a conscious man. This may happen on the home ground, so to speak, or it may happen in a wholly new situation, just as a man may found a family in a distant land because he senses that the soil has become exhausted or the atmosphere vitiated in his homeland. Rodney Collin's intuition leads him to pinpoint Egypt as the source which sired Europe. The identity of the individual can probably never be known, but certain key figures, half legendary, like Solon, Thales, and Pythagoras, may suggest the school within which the birth was accomplished. Plato's writing suggests that Solon received something from Sais in 590 BC, and the Timaeus suggests that the Egyptians held Athens in special affection. Was this, Rodney Collin asks, the affection of parent for child? It is significant that Solon, Thales, and Pythagoras have a certain extended quality about them. They appear as men having not one skill beyond the human ordinary, but a whole range of superlative achievements. Thales was a civil engineer, a politician, a mathematician, and an astronomer. He is credited with the theory of a prime source cosmic substance which was symbolized for external understanding as water. Pythagoras revealed a system of medicine, some unsuspected fragments of which appear to be embedded in the work of Cato the Censor, a geometry which stated the laws of 3-dimensional space, and a musical octave which gave the key to harmony on many levels. He is credited with a theory of soul ascent and descent, and also with access to his own reincarnative history. Into a lifetime of 80 or go years he packed, said Empedocles, all things that are contained in 10, even 20 generations of men. Insights, 2,000 years before their time, were in the very air. Xenophanes of Colophon is saying that the sun and stars have neither substance nor permanence. The stars are burned out at dawn, and in the evening are recreated from new exhalations. Arthur Koestler thinks that this is an example of a rational account of the universe beginning to emerge in the only idiom available, that of superstition. Could it not equally be a glimpse of the modern idea of a recreating universe? Or, if for dawn you wrote Day of Brahm, an insight into the Manvantaric idea? Koestler makes much play of the fact that the Greek schools were contradictory, that their alleged insights cancelled each other out. Every philosopher of the period, he says, seems to have had his own theory regarding the nature of the universe. To quote Professor Burnett, no sooner did an Ionian philosopher learn half a dozen geometrical propositions and hear that the phenomena of the heavens recurred in cycles, than he set to work to look for law everywhere in nature, and with an audacity amounting to hybris, to construct a system in the universe. It may be that a very important point is being lost here: access to a level of consciousness at which the laws of the universe may be experienced does not automatically provide the means whereby the knowledge can be verbalized or indeed rendered into fact at all. The implication, "this is how things are, because I have been there and seen," is at the mercy of the intellectual and emotional instrument through which the translation has to be managed. It is not the divergence of the Greek schools that is remarkable, but the overlap of their insights. Gestation over, the firstborn of modern Europe, was delivered into the light and air of Greece. The picture of its expression, maturity and decline is wonderfully sketched by Rodney Collin. Within 80 years, on the shores of Greece and southern Italy, where only tile and timber had stood before, rose the most subtle temples ever built by man. To make possible this tremendous achievement, Pythagoras had already developed the inner laws of harmony and worked out their manifestations for a new architecture, arid a new music. Anaximander, a pupil of Thales, had invented the basic instruments of a new technology, the gnomon, the clock, the astronomical sphere. Unknown sculptors had woken Egyptian statuary from its age-old immobility and created the figure of the kouros, the wide-eyed man of the new age. Vase painters set a symbolic mythology of the relation between man and gods. In every home, and the dramatic form of tragedy, created by Thespis, revealed the eternal clash between the willfulness of man and the higher laws of the universe. Yet behind this diversity, we sense one informing source, some hidden center of vitality which is suggested but never revealed by the strange role of the Eleusinian mysteries. It is interesting to observe the workings of the laws of scale. We saw how the human organism grows according to a definite curve from a single cell to many billions. So, for a civilization, thus Greek culture, all its potentialities compressed at the beginning of the 6th century into one man and a handful of men, by mid-century had already absorbed some hundreds of the best and most creative individuals, and by the end had organized into a new pattern of life thousands of citizens of Athens, Croton, Syracuse, and a half-dozen other centers. This growth or incorporation of larger and larger numbers of human cells continued steadily. At the same time, in exact proportion to this growth, the intensity of Hellenization diminishes, and the last millions drawn into the Greek body politic tend rather to obscure its nature. No doubt they would have accomplished its destruction entirely had it not been for the more conscious men like Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and others who continue to be produced from the center. Even so, the time comes when the inner life of the culture is insufficient to hold in check the decay which is always waiting to attack an over-ripe organism. The conquests fall away and the Greek world, like an old man, begins to shrink and stoop. When it is but 4.5 centuries old, it falls under the sway of the new Roman civilization, and thereafter lives a servile life, teaching or pandering to its young master, until, 800 years from its founding, the Greek homeland is overrun by Goths, and the Hellenic civilization finally dies as an independent organism. It would be difficult to imagine a more vivid picture of the life and death of an historical organism seen from the insight of biological time. So the Greek cell in the body of human history lived its life, performed its function, and died. It was sired from Egypt, and its parent was one, perhaps the last, in a previous group whose cycle we do not know. It is possible that Egypt fertilized other ground than the Greek. In the 10th and 11th centuries AD, we shall find an Eastern cousin with a remarkable role to play in the family affairs of Europe, and we may suspect that its parent too was Egypt. Beginning with Greece, Rodney Collin sees a chain of 6 cultures till the present. We shall continue to attempt a summary of his map of history. While Greece was still only 2 centuries old, she transmitted via the Epicureans and the Stoics the energy of fertilization to Rome, again a period of dazzling achievement seemingly from nowhere. As the signature of Greece was drama, music, philosophy, and mathematics, that of Rome was a code of law and an empire-wide chain of roads and public works. At its height, it served as the matrix for the third European organism, the early Christian. Here there is open record of a founder and his school, and of a signature, the New Testament, the sign manual of the whole organism to be. Yet astonishing and significant for the future, as was this newest cell in the body of mankind, tremendous as was its scope, its external form followed the inevitable laws of birth, development, and decline. It reached maturity with Constantine's Edict of Tolerance and then became subject to the progressive atrophy, which no organism actualizing in time may evade. In Rodney Collin's phrase, 8 centuries from its conception, the papacy, its highest temporal expression, was an object of commercial haggling on the Roman market. So died the external form of the early Christian culture, but long before, while it was still at its height, a new birth was planned. In 529, Benedict founded Monte Cassino and conducted an operation which, though it must certainly have had precedence in the cycles of antiquity, has, till the present time, no parallel in Europe. A conception was arranged, but the birth had to be delayed. If historical organisms have a relationship with the musical octave as well as with the logarithmic scale, and there are reasons to suppose that they do, there will not be a linear progression, a regular increase of frequency in an ascending scale. At 2 points, there will be intervals. Between early Christian and monastic Christendom, there will be one such gap, and the Dark Ages would certainly occupy such a place. The withdrawal of the 4 centers during the last glaciation suggests a parallel on another scale. Force had to be conserved till the time was right to leap the gap. Benedict's task was to encapsulate the gains of the past till a new ovum, existing but not yet actualized at the far end of the Dark Ages, was ready to be fertilized. During the Dark Ages, the monasteries with their monks were self-sufficient, perhaps in the same way as the centers, with their pilot populations, had to be in the Dark Ages of the glaciation. Outside there was disorder among events, confusion among men, processes without design, humanity without direction. The gap lasted 500 years, and the next cultural organism, the medieval Christian, did not emerge till the 11th century. Its mother was a lonely valley in Burgundy. Its father was the influence of Monte Cassino. Assisting at the birth somewhere in the shadows was the Comacene influence from northern Italy. The medieval Christian culture was 2 centuries in labor, and in a sense, it seems to have emerged from a single building, the Abbey Church of Cluny. The abbey was founded in 910 by 12 monks from Monte Cassino, and from this peaceful retreat in strife-torn France, an extraordinary influence spread. Within a century, the Cluniacs had gained control of 1,000 square miles of surrounding country, and were establishing the rule of law and order where there had been little or none for 5 centuries. As with a human body whose crisis of illness is reached, infection is dispelled at a rate which seemed possible only the day before. So with the Cluniac influence. By 1095, a great new building in a strange and wholly unfamiliar style was ready to be consecrated, the Abbey Church of Cluny. By Cazad, 1095, it was encapsulated all the Gothic cathedrals to come. In each of these, there was a suggestion of a whole unseen cosmology, each an encyclopedia in stone, containing, for those who could read, so tradition has it, a summary of the plan and purpose of evolution. Conceived in an ecclesiastical body, the medieval Christian culture was nevertheless designed for a new and different kind of expression. Though conceived by conscious men who were deeply committed to a religious expression of the great work, the medieval Christian culture depended for its execution on exponents who were not churchmen at all, but craftsmen. As the zodiac seems to sweep the solar system with a predestined progression of influences, it might seem that in the 11th century the process of conscious direction was almost imperceptibly leaving the sign of religion and edging marginally into some secular modality that lay ahead. An echo of this bivalency seems to attach to the anonymous craftsmen who built the cathedrals, as it does to their descendants in theory, the modern Freemasons. In passing, it might be noted that the period reflects another one in a different spiral, when universal encyclopedias in stone were also used to focus men's minds, the time of esoteric building in Islam. As there were other schools beside that of Pythagoras in Greece, there were other neighbour schools to Cluny, Chartres for many studies, Rien for music, Mont Saint-Michel for astronomy. Now occurs an event whose significance seems to have been little considered. A joint mission from Cluny and Chartres goes to Saracen Spain and is apparently received with fraternal regard. It sends back knowledge, logarithms, algebra, the Quran, perhaps one might guess a technique of alchemy. Here, apparently, a focus of intense Christianity is acquiring sustenance from a source which, at ordinary level, it could regard only as alien and indeed hostile. Unless this visit was some extra-ecumenical whim of the Gothic school, it suggests the existence of some hidden unity behind appearances. Could it be unity of a hidden directorate of evolution which subtends both Christianity and Islam? Constantine had an assistant at Cassino, Johannes the Saracen, who helped in translations. The idea of pilgrimage already existed, but it is suddenly expanded by the Cluniacs. Northern Spain is cleared of the Saracens, and Cluniac influence builds St. James of Compostela. The pilgrimage circuit now runs from Rome to Canterbury to Compostela. Could this idea have come from Saracen Spain as an instrument for broadening men's minds, for bringing new currents into stagnant society? Perhaps the Hajj, the Mecca pilgrimage, had proved its worth as a cultural instrument and was being used again. So on the one hand, the Cluniacs are going to a Moslem school. On the other hand, they are building cathedrals at the expense of Saracen territory. This strange ambivalence is exemplified further. The Cluniacs greatly approved of the First Crusade. Perhaps at the level of political expediency, it had many advantages. It drew off the looters and the freebooters from France and facilitated the Cluniac mission to extend local law and order. But it was directed, however obliquely, against Islam. On the one hand, collaboration, on the other, competition. There is an incongruity here that has no obvious explanation. But if we consider the possibility that at some level both impulses are modalities of the same evolutionary directive, the problem disappears. At the same time, the ways of the hidden directorate appear mysterious indeed to human judgment. Could it be that certain evolutionary gains may be obtained only within some environment of friction intentionally created? Repugnant as this idea may be at the level of individual lives, it is not without support in the esotericism of Jewry. Professor Norman Cohn has shown beyond any reasonable doubt that the famous protocols of the Elders of Zion were deliberate invention, but nobody seems to have examined the psychological basis on which the central theme of the protocols could have arisen in the human mind. The suggestion, briefly, is that some hidden impulse at racial level continually arranges for the Jews to initiate such action as will ensure their own persecution, within which some result beneficial to Jewry can arise. If man is coaxed, all but coerced along the optimum line of his own evolution by contrived situations which involve enormous suffering for individual men, the hidden directorate would appear to stand accused of a cynicism and despotism which individual men are to some extent already able to transcend. It is a problem which will press increasingly as further data emerges. But we must return to Rodney Collin's sequence of cultures. The medieval Christian culture grew, its pilgrimages and its crusades bringing cultural diffusion to Europe, as the dispersal brought diffusion to the root races of the world. At its peak, the Cluniac influence spanned Europe from Portugal to Poland. It delivered its possibilities, grew old and effete. Its adaptability became frozen. Its creativity became petrified in dogmatism. The Catholicity of the universal encyclopedias became the monstrous tyranny of the Inquisition. The body of the culture lived on for a total of 900 years and was finally dispatched by the French Revolution. Significantly, the citizens razed the Abbey of Cluny in an act more symbolic than they knew. But long before, a new impulse had been born out of the old. Round the Medicis had grown a new idea, opposed to the dogmatism represented by the Pope and devoted to the best of the past. The seedbed this time was neither a philosophical school nor a monk's cell. It was the milieu of an intelligentsia. Cosimo Medici becomes the central magnet to which all that is new is attracted. He founds the first public library in Europe. The best of the past is salvaged from Constantinople. Florence becomes the epicenter of Europe. Everything seems to be in a process of remaking round a court of sensitive intellectuals. We see Donatello, Ghiberti, Botticelli, Mirandola and Alberti, each supremely qualified in his own sphere, and a strange breed of hyperspecialists, like Michelangelo and Da Vinci, who are supremely qualified not in any one branch of human capacity, but in nearly all. The glimpse is of the uomo universal, the Weltmensch. Pythagoras and Thales are re-echoed on a new turn of the spiral. And how far this time the waves spread. Out of Florence come Queen's, Cambridge, Magdalen, Oxford, Glasgow University, the voyages of Columbus, the conquest of Mexico, modern astronomy, the English Renaissance, the encyclopedias, and finally, universal education. The modern world was born into Florence about 1450. Its signature, printing, painting, and education. The body of the Renaissance cell lives still. It may not die for another 200 years. Its influence, even now, is seen as reactionary, as all lives must finally seem to their own offspring. But though the Renaissance lives on to kindle or restrain in its declining years, it gave birth, just over a century ago, to its own successor, our all too familiar west of the present day. It is a lusty and perhaps willful infant, this synthetic age of ours, and its imprint on the body of history is electronics. Its gestation lasted from 1859, the origin of the species, till 1865, the unification of America. It reached the peak of its development about 1935, with road and air transport and radio, and the cinema established as its commonplace modalities. It is now on the path of maturity and gradual decline. Like all organisms, it must suffer increasing rigidity, the onset of feebleness, and eventual death. It may continue as a physical presence till the 27th century, but long before that, its successor, unseen and unsuspected, will have come to birth. If a culture sires its successor during its maturity, the latest cell in the body of history may even now be in gestation. If and when it is born, it will have to make its mark in a world of increasing speed, tension, and compression. If we in the 1980s find the pace of evolution almost too much, we can hardly imagine the pressures which the human cells in the coming body of culture will have to accept as normal. From Pythagoras to the Pentagon, 12,000 generations of men, 2,500 calendar years, 6 cells in the body of Western history. Each cell overlaps its successor's time, sending influences forward, each successor influencing and being influenced by the presence of its ancestors. Within each cell, smaller cells of influence, reinforcing the keynote of the whole, subject to the entropy of the whole. Wave upon interlocking wave of influence, a living body of history. And within and over all the inescapable signs of purpose and intent. Rodney Collin's tremendous account need not stand or fall on fact. Interpretation derived even from first-hand insight must inevitably be subject to the distortions of translation from one dimension to another. Even if the pattern is correctly brought down, certain datum points from which cycles are seen to start may well be arbitrary. A scheme of history such as this must be judged in its wholeness, and not by the seeming accuracy of its parts. It must be judged, in P.D. Ouspensky's phrase, by the psychological method. So judged, it must surely be felt to have an overall rightness, which is invulnerable to a demonstration that this or that aspect must be wrong. There we must leave it. Rodney Collin would certainly have condemned certain of our unwarranted intrusions into the broad sweep of his insights. He might not agree at all that the withdrawal was an interval on a larger octave corresponding to the Dark Ages in the small cycle of Europe. Almost certainly he would reject the suggestion that the Renaissance exhibited a zodiacal swing away from religion and towards a modality of influence for which we do not even have a name. Behind such a suggestion there is inevitably an implication that religion is not the instrument of man's evolution, but only one of a number of similar modalities that apply in turn. Nor would he probably agree with the suggestion that the hidden executive may achieve evolutionary gains by a process apparently indifferent to human life and suffering. Both suggestions would probably have been anathema to his Catholic beliefs. We have not, however, introduced such ideas arbitrarily, but because they are necessary to explain material which has only recently emerged, material which was certainly not available to Rodney Collin. Standing on its own, each account presents overwhelming support for a single idea, that the life of man is subject to direction by forces or individuals above, but not infinitely above, the level of man himself. Equally inescapable is the idea that such direction is implemented at the level of life by human agents, that is, by exceptional men attuned to and partly identified with the level above. Is the idea so very impossible? At each stage in evolution, the universe expands to the human mind. The first limit of his horizon is nature. God is the trees and the seas and the wind. Then his consciousness expands one step, and so does his universe. Now the planets represent divinity, and animism, once the good, is now the enemy of the better. Again his mind opens. The sun is now seen as the absolute, subtending and controlling the planets, gods serving God. Later the sun is seen to be only one of many suns in a galaxy of suns, and faster the horizon recedes. The galaxy is only one of innumerable galaxies in a greater whole. This lies at the end of a road where thought cannot reach at all. At each stage, man has to abandon the secure, the trusted and, for his present moment, the ultimate. At each stage, he has to struggle with the denying force of inertia. He has to surmount a mental obstacle, as once he had to surmount biological obstacles. If he succeeds, he learns more, understands more, gets closer and closer to participating. It may be that he is now required to confront and accept the mechanism of his own evolution. A new, yet old concept may confront him, the presence of men among mankind who are his teachers and his taskmasters on the evolutionary road. He may now have to meet once again, after 30,000 years, but on a higher turn of the spiral of understanding, the presence of secret people in his midst. Who are they? Is it possible to glimpse them, first in the pages of history, then dimly at first, in the daily life of our own times? Perhaps we may catch such a glimpse.